doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
You've been participating over the past several months, including the Africa Climate Summit. And so from your perspective, what do we need at the COP? What are the things that need to be decided, the processes that need to be put in place, especially from the finance community? Just a general introduction on your side on how you see the landscape looking.
Yes, no, thank you very much. I'm glad my colleague said that we can be frank and fair as colleagues and fellow citizens in this planet of ours that we have to protect. And thank you for the invitation to speak on behalf of the African as well as the global institutional investment community. So ambition, these days when we talk about ambition relative to the scale of the task, I think we're probably all very unambitious, requiring, recognizing what's really required to actually get us to where we need to get to. I think our observation is that the financing component, the investment need, is unprecedented, as I think we all know. We're hearing numbers now that are run-of-mill, that have never really been achieved on any scale before. But I suppose when we think about and look at the whole contextualization of ambition, I think we have a concern. And our concern is that we think the underlying vision for private capital mobilization at scale is fundamentally flawed. It's fundamentally flawed because it's a development-driven, a public sector-driven agenda to mobilize private capital. Now, if we wanted to accelerate and scale the mobilization of public capital, then I don't think that should be led by the private sector. But I think what we have now is we have public sector mindsets architecting how to mobilize private capital at scale with a track record which sort of suggests that if they were delivering that mandate, they would meet their targets. And their targets have been set very clearly and restated by the G20, which is for every $1 of multilateral development bank finance that they provide, they are supposed to mobilize $10 of private finance. What's the reality? What's the outcome? What's the performance of that? Well, historically and currently, for every $1 of MDB finance that they provide, they mobilize between 20 cents and 38 cents. I mean, that's the reality. And then if you couple that with the fact that the agenda has been characterized as one that should actually be led by the multilateral development banks and the global financial architecture is orienting everything along those lines, our governments are spending about 90% of their time working on the private capital mobilization agenda with MDBs, who even if we optimize the ability for them to leverage their balance sheets to de-risk and crowd in private capital, post the reforms that we are hoping that will happen, even if those reforms happen, they will only be able to close a mere 10% of the finance and the investment gap. Whilst our same governments are spending less than 10% of their time with the global institutional investment community representing $150 to $200 trillion of assets under management globally, less than 10% of that time with our constituency that can solve 90% of the investment gap. So I think there's a fundamental problem that we have here, and I think that we're calling for COP28 to sort of break the ice there, break the ground on what we would like to see, and we're describing that as climate investment statesmanship. We need heads of state to really get in front of this issue and understand that all of the nationally determined contribution projects and all of these other opportunities will not attract the private investment that's required. And let's not forget, emerging markets and developing countries, the majority of our nationally determined contribution projects will need to come from the private sector. We do not have the luxury of the sort of the fiscal capacity that maybe G7 nations have, where they can throw major incentives. So we're going to have to actually have a very different posture and a very different level of engagement with the private sector. And so I really do hope that that's what COP28 can deliver for us. So that is really an earth shot. And I think underlying all of this, we as the investment community see the whole climate transition as one of the generational investment opportunities of our time. But we need climate investment statesmanship. And I think fundamentally, one of the areas that I don't think has really been addressed at any good level is the extent to which we can collectively reimagine how to accelerate the geopolitical decision-making process. That's the fundamental elephant in the room. Great ideas, great science, great ideas from the private sector, but until we can get that uniform approach to geopolitical decision-making process. Have we seen that recently? Probably not for a long time, but we've seen, not a great example, but if you look at what happened with COVID, we were all at least able to get some degree of synchronicity. And I don't think that we've actually really worked hard enough, and maybe we need some of your firms and institutions to really begin to reimagine and give our leaders a perspective about how we can accelerate that process, because the climate clock is ticking and it's not ticking in our favor. Thank you.
Thank you. And some sobering numbers, but also something that we discussed back in May around people who are involved in the process speak about climate finance, speak about involving the private sector, and I've bumped into a few former negotiators over the past several days and who no longer negotiate and said, it's funny that we used to talk about involving the private sector. We had no idea. And I think there's an important role to play around building financial literacy or collaboration across the different actors within that space. And so I hope that we can kind of move on that discussion.
Can I just add one thing there? I mean, to that point, and I think we experienced that together at the NDC conference in Berlin. There seems to be this collective approach to ensuring that the word investment.
Yeah.
And we actually see this entire transformation, the climate transformation, the climate transition. In Africa, we say it's a transformation because of the low levels of access to energy. Well, we have to transform before we can transition. But the whole agenda is, in our view, a medium to long-term investment agenda. And if we continue with this MDB, concessional, green finance characterization, we know that we're going to run very quickly into a green finance debt crisis for many of our governments. So we need to be able to bring on board long-term capital that plans for the long term, take some equity co-ownership participation and have that longer-term view. Otherwise, I think we're going to be in a very, very bad place. Thank you.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.